Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here with us today. This is the first part of a two-part session, essentially, on commercialization, which we're focusing on today, and fundraising, which we'll be covering on Thursday. So the way we think about commercialization, as you'll see today, we'll cover the notions of business plan, the notion of a business model, and how to think about building a company. But we'll also start diving quite deeply in market analysis, giving you some of the tools that we're using in our day-to-day with some of our clients and partners. And then we'll get into what we call technical consideration. So obviously, market access is a big topic. When you think about regulation, when you think about reimbursement and IP, these are obviously big topics for a neuro startup. So we'll make sure that we cover all of that today. And we've planned to have a session which is which has a fair amount of breadth, quite some depth, but naturally in an hour and a half, it's hard to cover everything. So we'll keep some time at the end of the call to make sure that we can address any question that there is, and obviously very happy to chat after today's session if anyone wants to reach out to us. So on that note, maybe Radhika, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll start. So we cover neurotechnology, and one question that often comes to us is, what is neurotechnology? And, the definition is actually not the same for everyone. The way we think about it is any technology that interfaces with the central or peripheral nervous system. And this can also touch upon non-medical use case. So what we wanted to do on this slide is just give you examples of different companies that cover many, many elements. Mindfulness and wellness, like Ura, to us, is a neurotechnology company. You also have companies like Neuralink, obviously, which is a brain implant with the objective of namely having sensory restoration. You have companies like Cognition, which maybe is somewhere in the middle, which can support essentially communication for people affected by cerebral palsy. So neurotechnology is a very broad industry, and it's important to think about it that way because the use case and the final user or patient might be very, very different depending on what you're actually doing as a neurotech startup. So these are nuances that someone should keep in mind. Who are we? Well, in a nutshell, we're a firm specialized in neurotech and digital health related to the neurospace. So we provide advisory services. We work a lot on go-to-market strategy. We help companies when they are planning their fundraising. We can also have technical and scientific reviews of their innovations, help them define what use cases they should be thinking about. And we work also on market access. A bit about us in the history. So in 2015, a not-for-profit called Neurotech X was founded. And now, 8 years later in 2023, this community is actually 20,000 members in over 100 countries. So NTX Services is a little bit different. What we decided to do is to build a multidisciplinary team in-house, but also collaborate exclusively with that not-for-profit. So we have a database of thousands of experts. We can reach out to them if there's something very specific we need to talk about in terms of technology or indication. But we have that symbiosis and symbiotic relationship where Neurotech X, can send startups or companies or people with questions to us, and we can also work with them when there are certain topics of collaboration. So 4 years in, NTX Services, we've done over 100 projects. We work around the world, North America, Europe, and Asia. And we're very happy to say that we work as much with, lab spin-offs and very early stage companies up to Series ABC, but also with large strategics, which need some time to, review what solutions are out there on the market and discuss with us to see what could be interesting in terms of synergies for them. I'll say a few words about myself, but I'll go quickly. So I got involved in the neurotech industry 6-7 years ago. Before that, I worked half of my career in finance, half in strategy, CPA, CFA by trade, and work in different environments from corporate finance and restructuring, investments, management consulting. I've done a couple of things before getting involved in the industry. And on a personal note, one thing that stood out to me when I started getting involved in neurotech is that everyone had questions, right? How do I commercialize my technology? What indications can I target? What is the rec path that's ahead of me? How can I even think about fundraising? When do I start raising funds? And what we decided to do was really to get involved in order to kind of fill those gaps and help as much as possible the whole industry move forward when we could. On that note, Radhika, I will let you introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. So I work with Adam, essentially managing the operations. What that means is I typically staff the projects, make sure things are delivered in time, quality check the content, etc. My background, a little bit similar to Adam, is that I did work in investments prior to this at PSB Investments. My early career was also in marketing, though, so I try to bring both of those lenses together in the work that we do at NTX Services. I also hold the CFA designation and an MBA from McGill University here at Montreal. And with Adam, we have worked across, I think, 20 plus technologies on 100 different projects around the world.
Yep. And while they're not here today, you know, our team, as I said, is multidisciplinary. We have people that were, you know, CEOs and executives of different neurotech companies. We have, you know, tech specialists, scientific specialists, people that worked in different environments from digital health to invasive companies. So we actually have something quite complete. In terms of the objective for today and Thursday, so one, we want to really go over what are the key elements of a business model and business plan and how that might be different for a neuro company. We'll look at technical considerations, which can include R&D, obviously, but also IP regulation and reimbursement. Thursday, we'll look a lot at financial modeling, fundraising, and kind of talk about the current fundraising environment. And overall, you know, what we want to do is always to strike a balance between, you know, useful insights and also not being too negative on what it means to commercialize neurotech. Why I'm saying this is that it's a very, very interesting industry, but it's also one with many challenges and hurdles. So our goal is always just to give as much information as we can. So any company that is thinking about commercializing neuro and neurotech knows what's ahead of them and can start planning early on in terms of, you know, their next steps and their overall model. So without further ado, let's get into section one. So business inception. One thing that we wanted to showcase here is essentially about the notion of iteration, you know. One thing that people talk about a lot with startups is you'll have to iterate, you can break things, it's okay. It is a little bit different sometimes in neurotech, and it is different in general in healthcare. If you're thinking about iterating, that is good. At the same time, it cannot be at the detriment of regulation. You cannot start testing in human before you're allowed to do it. You cannot do certain things without having the right scientific backing and the right confirmation in terms of, you know, mechanism of action of technology. But in consumer application, that can be a little bit different as long as you respect security protocol. What we wanted to show on this slide is actually pictures that were shared by our friends at Neurable. Some of you might know them. What they've developed today is headphones, essentially, that can allow people to focus and to have a better sense, essentially, of, you know, when they're focused, how they're focused, and to help them in that regard. Essentially, what we wanted to do is that show, you know, if you look at where they started, their proof of concept was completely different, right? We're talking about being able to read information from the brain. And they evolved, if you look at the third picture, the MVP, that is actually a AR, VR type of solution where they were targeting namely the gaming market. So even a company like them, which were always more consumer driven, at least you can see that in the third picture, ended up changing the form factor completely when they were thinking about how to get to their final user and how they wanted to kind of hit the market and the type of solution. Yeah, next slide. So what's the business model? We'll get back to the basics and we'll start diving in a little bit. Value proposition, value chain, and revenue model. So these are the three pillars of it. One thing that I would really kind of put the emphasis on is the revenue model. The last year or two have changed a lot. I think that it's really important to understand that while for a while, even in medtech, it was considered that it was a lot of R&D. It was important to really kind of advance and prove the feasibility of a product. With that in mind, defining a revenue model and showing a path to profitability has been increasingly important. So one thing that is really key here is to understand that in the current market, and we think it's a very positive thing, defining a clear revenue model, even early on, even as you're defining your solution, is important. However, obviously, the level of detail has to be adjusted to the life stage of the company. So let's go a little bit, in each of them, and we'll give you some examples. The first one that we wanted to talk about is value proposition. So value proposition is really about, what is the value you create? What are you providing to users? One thing that we often see when we work with companies is something that is technically interesting, but when we start kind of diving a little bit, when you compare it to state of the art, existing technology, and kind of the hurdles that you have to get through to get your solution to market, the value actually provided to a medical practitioner or a patient is not always as obvious, at least when you start really getting into details and trying to define the extent at which your solution provides value versus the state of the art. So some solutions, I think, however, make it a little bit more obvious. One example that I could talk about is NeuroPace. It's an RNS system for epilepsy, which is FDA approved. What they do essentially is they can detect and stimulate different areas of the brain to stop or limit a seizure activity from an epileptic patient. Now, you're talking about a population in need. You're talking about levels of severities where some people do not have a good solution to limit the severity of the seizures they have. So this is one example where in neuro, when you're targeting an obvious problem with a clear solution, the path can be long, it can be expensive to get to market. But again, in terms of value proposition, when you take a step back, you really have to make sure that you're providing something that has a significant value for the different users. The other element that we wanted to talk about here is about value chains. Value chain is something that can be a little bit underestimated. And one thing that we think is sometimes left aside is the last one, customer support. So you have to do R&D, you have to figure out how you're going to get your product, built at a decent price and how you're going to deliver it. We know companies that have essentially, not been able to support their business model and essentially lost a significant amount of their profitability simply due to the last factor. People were not happy. They asked for reimbursement, for a refund. They weren't sure about how the thing was working, and they lost all of traction for that. So one thing to consider with the value chain is that it's really from something that has to be considered from A to Z. It is very, very important to consider the last piece, which is customer support. Companies like Tobii Dynavox, for example, which have a communication device that can help people with cerebral palsy, has been quite excellent in that, in the sense that as you sell your device, you have funding consultants that can help purchasers in getting refunded and reimbursed. And after that, they even have after-sale support. They monitor Facebook groups and support groups, and they have experts monitoring and supporting the population so they can really kind of help them making sure that they use the product right and that they have answers to their questions. So that's a really important point about value chain. Obviously, R&D is the first piece of the puzzle, but it's really important to think about it throughout, and that can have a significant impact on the funds needed also once you start commercializing. Revenue model, obviously another important topic. So for revenue model, what we believe is that you should understand your short-term and your long-term strategy. When you start having a device and a software associated to it, there are multiple techniques. One example I could give, if you look at the Muse headset that is used for meditation, the device is sold at a certain price. I think the Gen 2 is sold at around $340 today, but there's a software subscription sold separately. So one thing that is very important to understand is, as you try to penetrate the market, you have to find a balance between, having an affordable price for your hardware, knowing you might get some upside on the software, adjusting as you have different versions of your product coming out. And it's really a balancing act, essentially, where depending on where you provide the value and how you provide value across time, there are multiple approaches here, and there's really no one size fit all. So it's important to understand your different scenarios and understand what your user might prefer in terms of payment. And that can also impact reimbursement, which we'll talk about later today, because reimbursement might be provided for the device. Sometimes it might be for the service. So it's really important to understand how your revenue model can match your expectation and your reimbursement strategy. So we'll go quickly over the business plan. I mean, I'm pretty sure that many people on the call, I've heard about this, worked on it, or developed business plans in the past. The best way to think about it is, how can you define your roadmap? How can you explain exactly how your business is going to be conducted on different fronts? And essentially reassuring yourself and your investors that there's a clear plan in terms of going from where you are today to the point where you're going to commercialize. So we're going to go over a couple of key elements from a business plan that we think have to be factored in the case of Neuro. Radhika, let's start with the first. So the first point is about the environment in which a company operates. And that's extremely important. What is the industry you're in? What is the geography you're selling into? very, very, very important impact on regulation, on the types of purchasers, on what it means on the medical system you're working with, if it's public, private, or both. So it's extremely important to very, very quickly say, this is my industry, this is my geography, this is my environment in terms of suppliers, clients, and competitors, and really set the stage for anyone reviewing your plan. Radhika is actually going to present a case study later today, and will essentially address some of those points at that moment. A marketing plan should highlight how a company plans to reach its clients over time. And so that goes back to the earlier point. Some people think about marketing as communication. Some of it considering it as after sale. And essentially, the way we are thinking about it is that it goes as early as product definition. So you might hear about the position called, product development, product owner. Marketing needs to be embedded in healthcare and health tech, essentially in terms of how you think about the product and making sure that your R&D is not just theoretical, but that it's aligned with the client needs and the patient needs. So it's one thing to consider. And obviously it encompasses many elements, also including pricing strategy, which we'll talk a bit about in the reimbursement section. Regarding reimbursement, I can see a comment on whether it's a technical consideration. I mean, one way to think about it is market access is reimbursement plus regulation plus prescription / distribution. So I would agree with David that there are many ways to slice and dice definitions. The reason why we call it technical is that we wanted to kind of separate the elements that are purely about the business and the R&D, call it, to the enablers that can allow a solution to be approved and refunded. But I would not disagree that, we've seen reimbursement being commingled with distribution and sales. We've seen it being bundled with regulation. That was just our way to kind of, split the topics with business plan, market analysis, and the other considerations kind of to support commercialization. Radhika, that's the next slide. R&D and regulation. So again, a topic, we'll talk about it a bit more in detail later. One thing that's really important here, I think, is that you need to make sure that your R&D is aligned with clinical trials and requirements. We know companies that we won't name, but we've had very unfortunate conversations with companies essentially looking at their pathways 2 years in, 3 years in, and saying, you know what, I was sure that my device was for consumers, but because I have this technology and it impacts the body and the brain that way, I now realize that I actually have studies and trials to put forward. I realize that I'm a class 2 device. I never thought I was. And regulation is something that changes over time, and it's something that's very specific to different countries. So one big thing that we would encourage companies to understand early on is, what is the path you want to take? What is the final consumer you want to reach? But don't necessarily think that because you're not aiming to have medical claims, that the nature of your solution will not impact how your device is regulated. And that is really an important point here. So while R&D is key, try to understand where you're heading and try to validate early on that you might not have a bad surprise when it comes to essentially having the right approvals to sell your device, even if it's meant for consumers in the first place. While single founders can be successful, building a team can be accretive. So this is something that we think is absolutely key. Founders, having a one-person founder in the team is doable. We would strongly encourage people to find complementary profiles. In Neurotech, we've seen a lot of CTO or CSO profiles and no CEO or commercial CEO per se. That can last a little bit, especially if the company is not planning on commercializing for a while. But we would encourage at least 2 or 3 profiles, very complementary, and ensuring that you have also advisors as much as possible to support the thought process and validate essentially the trajectory of the company. I'm getting a question here that's interesting about non-device neurotech products. So we'll get into it in the third section. There's software as a medical device, which NLP diagnostic tools I would think would fall under. There's medical device, there's in vitro also types of devices. For us, they would all essentially be encompassed into this. Considerations with software and data tend to be a little more profound and a bit more important. But in general, I would think that most of what we said applies to hardware, software, and in vitro diagnostics. There are a few nuances we'll get into later, but they're very all the concepts I think apply. And honestly, most medical device companies tend to think in parallel about what is the software solution that will complement it, what is the clinical interface, what is the value to the clinician, what is the patient going to see, and it tends to be a balance in a way between the hardware and the software, whether they're bundled within the same company or essentially managed through partnership. We know many software companies, for example, leading partnerships with medical device companies to kind of be complementary, but some of them also on the diagnostic side can be standalone. But we believe that most of the considerations, if not all of them, that we've mentioned today also apply, including on the regulation side. Radhika? In the context of a business plan, org structure needs to be planned. So one thing that if you start fundraising that you'll be asked is, okay, so where is my money going to be used? So naturally, I'm going to do a study, I'm going to do a trial, there's a lot of R&D going on. Maybe I'll try to show you how I'm going to get to market. We've seen many companies, however, leaving aside the team building and really having a clear perspective on what their org chart is going to look like. So one thing we would really encourage, as we said before, is think about your pathway, think about your areas of expertise, hardware, firmware, software, clinical trials, quality assurance, commercialization. You have many, many pieces in a neuro company. And it might really be a risky approach to kind of say, you know what, I really want to get the tech out there. And once it's approved, I'll really start thinking about commercialization. Or, quality insurance is important, but I haven't de-risked enough on the technical side. Let me move along a little bit on the R&D, and then I'll start bringing it in. It's extremely important to plan ahead and to know exactly who's going to join your team and when. That can provide quite a lot of assurance to your investors and also to the company to know how the flow is going to evolve, essentially. Partners and collaborators. So again, given that you're all attending a Matter session, I think that everyone is aware that you have many very successful and powerful organizations that can support a company as it's thinking about growing. In time, we've seen the most successful companies work with research partners that can develop studies and trials together. Talking to patient advocacy groups to make sure they have the right insights, that they're actually answering the needs of caregivers and consumers and patients. Incubators and accelerators can also be very powerful in giving a lot of insights, investments, as well as advisors. Grant funding, we're talking about a business anchored into R&D, so that's extremely important. And obviously validating early adopters. One example of a company that has done this extremely well would be Onward, which has allowed people, you might have seen in the news, to essentially have paralyzed people walk again based on spinal stimulation. And they had research partnerships with 14 research collaborators across the US, EU, and Canada. And that allowed them to generate 340 licensed patents. And that's based on their information. So it is really important to embed that. Some other relationships that they had built was with the Christopher and Dana Reese Foundation, with Praxis, with Wings for Life. They essentially created engagement not just with the research community, but also with advocacy groups and other relevant stakeholders. So this is something that has to be planned ahead. And you'll notice that having the right stakeholders by your side, especially if you're going to bring a new solution to market that is not in the treatment ladder, that is not common, that is coming in with a very different mechanism of action, it is extremely important to have partners all across essentially the process. Two more elements of this section. One is the cost consideration. So any business plan needs to be detailed on the cost side. So obviously, as you're growing, if you look at the arrows from left to right, if you're at the inception versus if you're at the proof of concept, or if you're at the commercialization, different elements will have different cost values associated with them, different levels of expected details. What we want to have essentially here, just to be clear, is that you need to know in advance at least one step ahead. So if you're at the inception stage, you have to get a sense of what is it going to cost for you once you reach, let's say, 1 to 3 years later. Because if you're raising money for your company, it's going to be great to know that you need to raise, I don't know, 1 to 3 million for your seed round. You need to do some studies, you need to hire 2-3 people. But the question will be, okay, but when are you going to raise again, and what are you raising for? So while pivoting and adjusting your strategy is obviously part of the approach, it is extremely important to be as detailed as possible on the cost side. And with the area where we've seen the most underestimation of cost is on the regulatory and clinical trial side. This is something that can be determined. We've done a lot of analysis in that regard for class 2 and 3 devices, including software solutions. And we've noticed that it is often shown as a best case scenario. And it is something that investors tend to be a little bit annoyed by when they say, look, I hear what you're saying, but you would be better than every company I've funded before. So buffer it out, try to get the right information. Radhika will get to that in a second, but don't underestimate the cost portion of your business plan. It is extremely important to understand the costs that are ahead of you. And Radhika, the last slide. So this is really what we're going to kind of look at on Thursday, financial projections and funding needs. It's always a balance in terms of, how much are you going to get from grants, how much are you going to get from private funding, what type of private funding. This is really something we'll cover on Thursday, but it can be very rewarding and useful to have that clearly outlined in your business plan. And one thing that is really important there is, how are you managing to leverage the existing ecosystem? If you're in an accelerator, how did you use this? If you were in academia, how did you get the IP out of the university? If you're collaborating with a research partner, did you get a grant for that? How are you managing to show that step by step you've been very conscientious about how you're planning your finances in alignment with the fact that the costs are probably going to be higher than what was anticipated in the first place? So with that in mind, Radhika, I will let you take it over with the second portion.
Thanks, Adam. I think in this section, we're just going to touch upon market analysis a little bit, but I do want to show some examples and case studies in the neuro space in particular, so that people, can have a sense of, how things have panned out in the real world. So at NTX Services, we look at market analysis holistically. It's fairly, we have a fairly data-driven approach. So we look at market segmentation separately. We look at competitive analysis separately. We look at distribution separately as well, which does include some portion of market access that we will get to later. And we also look at the value chain separately. I think if you're starting your company and in the early stages, there are many sources that you can use to get a sense of, your market. There are traditional paid sources like market intelligence reports, etc. But I would be careful with those because the quality of the public publishing house and how niche the specific industry is can impact the quality of insights you get. We found that they tend to be very good for reporting purposes, but less useful for insights. Additional sources, in your industry, if you're able to find publicly traded companies, the management discussion and analysis section of the annual reports filed by the companies can be very useful. So you'll remember in Adam's section, we gave examples like Onward and NeuroPace. These are publicly traded companies in the neuro space, and I encourage people to take a look at their financial statements to learn as much as they can. Finally, other sources of data are things like government statistics databases. The other thing that can be particularly useful in healthcare are sometimes insurance databases have information on actual behavior by expenditure for patients, which could be useful if you're planning out targeting a specific indication. So, I think that all of you are probably at the stage where you have already done essentially a market analysis by revenues, putting together a TAM, SAM, SUM, etc. I want to use a real world example. So this is the NeuroStar which is a non-invasive TMS company, which sells directly to psychiatrists. It's publicly traded, so all of this information is from their annual report. They're targeting major depressive disorder. So I just want to go through the exercise of how they size their market. So you start with the high-level information, right? How many patients are affected by MDD in the world? This is about 300 million people. But then the company needs to understand how many of these patients actually have access to treatment by a professional who can prescribe my solution. In this case, a psychiatrist. In my geography, you'll remember Adam alluded to geography in his market analysis intro. In this case, the geography was the US, and you'll see it's already quite a bit smaller, right? So about 13.9 million people had access to treatment. Now the other thing that is important is that in this case, TMS is not a first-line therapy, right? So it's not like an SSRI, et cetera. So it's important to understand how many people have failed to respond to the standard of care, which was drugs in the case of the US. And you'll see, again, it's about half the size of that initial market at 6.4 million people. Then you have to ask yourself, well, who's going to pay for this solution, right? Then you have to think about, wow, okay, how many of these people have access to insurance? And again, it's about half that initial number. So we're down to 3.8 million people. And then I think the other thing that was important for this company to understand is when in the patient journey would their solution be prescribed to a patient, right? So for example, TMS is considered to be appropriate to those who have NDD that have failed to respond to at least one prior antidepressant medication regime. So that means you're never going to be the first-line treatment for someone with MDD. Therefore, you have to, essentially account for, not being the initial solution of choice. The other thing that was important to understand is that TMS is typically office-based, right? And this influences the next question, right? Who is the customer, right? It's not necessarily the patient itself, even though that's your end user. It's really the psychiatrist who's paying for the solution. And then you have to ask yourself, what is the value add to my consumer or customer, right? In this company's case, there were several things that they used. So of course, efficacy and safety were important to the company, right? And limited side effects, right? The fact that it's office-based also allowed for high patient adherence. And that's because typically when solutions are designed, they often don't account for the fact that patients are not necessarily as regimented as they should be when the solution is prescribed. But to add value to their end consumer, which we've identified as the psychiatrist, this company also offers on-site clinical training to the psychiatrist. It helps them figure out reimbursement. It also offers service support. And I want to draw attention to this direct quote because they clearly identify that their consumer is the psychiatrist. And that's something to keep in mind when you're developing a medical solution. Your end consumer may not necessarily be the patient itself. And then once they identified that their market was psychiatrists, they had to understand how many psychiatrist clinics there are in the US. They identified, let's say, 26,000 sites. And there's about 50,000 psychiatrists working at these sites. And then after several years of, product development and commercialization, they were able to penetrate 959 sites. And I think the point I want to make here is that we talked about market access in the beginning of the business plan section. I want to point out here that market access is quite difficult. It typically involves a fair bit of sales and marketing personnel, which some of the more developed companies have told us in itself costs about $2 to $3 million a year for a single application. In Neurotech's case, for example, after 18 years since inception, the penetration rate is around 3.6%. So, for example, when you're projecting your market size, just make sure that you have a sense of who your end customer is and kind of more realistic expectations for yourselves on penetration rates. I think at NTX Services, we really believe in understanding consumer behavior, right? We've already talked through the case study about understanding who the end consumer is, but understanding how they behave is fairly important when you're developing a solution that's intended to be commercialized. I also want to spend a second just to point out that some people don't necessarily believe in traditional modes of analyzing consumer behavior, for example, market research reports, etc. And that's fine. I don't think that we necessarily need to ask people exactly what they want when you're developing an innovative solution, but it is fairly important to understand their observed behavior if you want to create a solution that really adds value to their lives. So let's talk about how this information can be used in the context of healthcare. This is an extract from, the patient journey for a stroke patient in the US. It's just a high-level extract. We haven't gone into the details. But let's say, for example, you were developing a solution for stroke rehabilitation. Right? There are many neurorehabilitation companies out there. If you were in that space, you'd probably focus your attention on this portion of it, right? The post-acute care services and the community living aspects of it, right? And it would be fairly important to understand that there are multiple stakeholders involved, right? So you have people addressing respiratory health, mental health, vocational rehab, exercise therapy, sexual health, cardiovascular health, etc. And it's also important to understand who owns the patient and who spends the most time with the patient as well. So, for example, one of the things we learned when we were looking at neuro rehab is that home healthcare workers actually spend sometimes 30 hours a week with stroke patients. This is just an example, of course. You'd have to perform this exercise in the context of the specific indication that you're targeting. We'll move on to what we call technical considerations. I think the name, we're not necessarily attached to the name. We don't mean technical in the sense that they're just scientific considerations. We mean technical in the sense that there's a set of hard skills associated with them. So let's talk about kind of some of the barriers that persist with regards to healthcare commercialization, right? I think the most important is that healthcare is a fragmented industry by design. It tends to be local, not global, just because you have multiple stakeholders at the state level, the federal level, et cetera, that aren't necessarily working seamlessly together. The other thing are consumers aren't generally used to paying for conventional healthcare. Most of the heavy utilizers of healthcare tend to have access to some level of insurance. Depending on the country in which you operate, there may be a situation where consumers see healthcare as a fundamental right as well, right? The other thing is a product has to be safe and efficacious, right? I think here we're really alluding to the regulatory process. Countries tend to have their own health authority. Here we're thinking about things like the FDA in the US, Health Canada in Canada, etc. The other thing that I think is ignored a lot by early stage companies from observation is that it's not enough that the product is both safe and efficacious. It should also be cost effective to the healthcare system. What I mean by that is by choosing an innovative solution over what's the current standard of care, I would ideally be saving the healthcare system some costs in the long run. And I think the final thing that we talk about is in order to encourage patient adoption, just because not all patients have the same level of comfort with new technology, you have to plan for adequate support to users once a sale is complete. I think in the beginning, Adam had alluded to the use case of Tobii Dynavox. I would encourage everyone listening to take a look at how they provide support to their end users once they purchase the solution, because they've managed to really keep the purchasers of their devices or solutions engaged. I think it's fairly, we use fairly strong language, assuming that you have a medical solution. Regulation is a cornerstone of any commercialization plan in the neuro space, right? I think it's fairly important as early as possible to at least get a sense of the high-level regulatory strategy and the roadmap you're going to use. What we've seen health authorities say is essentially, please start talking to them as early as possible, even in terms of informal conversations. Please talk to regulatory consultants, try to get people with some level of experience in the reg space on your advisory board, etc. I think different types of technologies and solutions need to be regulated. So coming back to the point that I'm trying to remember who someone made earlier regarding software solutions. What needs to be regulated? So we're thinking about medical devices. So this is hardware devices, hardware with embedded software. And then the other thing is software as a medical device. So I think if we're thinking about examples of solutions like this, you're thinking about things like Click Therapeutics. You have solutions like Pear, like Akili. These are software solutions, but they are software as a medical device. And then you have in vitro diagnostic medical devices as well. A lot of companies come to us essentially trying to play the line between what is regulated and what is not. And what we always tell them is that your claims are the key, right? So the claims of what your product says you can do at the end of the day is the key differentiator between a regulated and non-regulated product. So for example, if I just have a solution that provides emotional support to patients that is software-based, that's fine. However, if I make a marketing claim that solution will address anxiety or reduce anxiety by X percentage, etc., it's fairly important to understand that that's going to fall under a regulated category. There's typically 3 types of regulatory classes for medical devices. We focused on the US market today, just because this is based on a US audience. Typically, there's class 1, which is a low risk device, class 2, which is moderate risk, and class 3, which is high risk. So examples of class 1 are available on the slide. if you go on the FDA database, there's about 1,700 or so medical devices that kind of could act as predicates to facilitate the regulatory pathway of novel solutions. And we'll kind of explain a little bit more on the next slide. Again, this is very high level, but we'll just give you kind of an overview. The role of the FDA is to really monitor safety and efficacy. So when you have a novel solution, their concern is it safe and does it work? You have class 1, class 2, and class 3. Just for reference, class 3 devices are the only ones that can be quote unquote approved by the FDA. The rest are typically just FDA cleared. You have several types of submissions. You have an IDE, a 510K, a humanitarian device exemption, or an HDE, and a PMA pathway. There's typically various types of studies of steps to be undertaken. Excuse me. And if you see the diagram that we have, hopefully that essentially helps clarify a few things for some of you. So for example, if you're a class 1 device, you only have to go through general controls and you're cleared to market the device. If you're a class 2 device, you have to find a substantially equivalent predicate. A good example of this is, I don't know if you're following the neuro industry, but Flow Neuroscience, for example, was able to use the CES product code to get to market. Then you have a humanitarian device exemption, and that's where essentially where people look at the solution as though in terms of the probable benefit outweighing the risk of the solution. An example of a company that did this, if you just for your own knowledge, is Novocure, which is a solution focused on glioblastoma. And then you have the PMA pathway, and the standard there is a reasonable assurance of safety and efficacy. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that even if you're developing an application that is consumer-based, it's unlikely that you would be able to market it without any evidence to support your marketing claims. An example of a case that was settled in this space was the brain training app Lumosity. And it was essentially taken to court by the FTC, largely because they did not have the science to back up the claims they made on their marketing. For anyone who's curious, the FTC has released comprehensive guidelines that are available for the general public to read at their leisure. So feel free to look them up on your own time. I won't go over this in detail, but generally speaking, there's also certifications and standards. Even for a consumer device, when you're developing a solution for a given market. In our case, some of the augmented and assistive communication companies we've worked with in the past did need to meet certain certification standards to be marketed in a given country. Let's talk about reimbursement. When we talk about reimbursement, there's several different stakeholders that you need to be aware of. There's, of course, the regulatory pathway, which is through the health authority. We're using the US as an example here, so we've listed the FDA. There's Medicare, which is a federal health insurance program, typically covers individuals over the age of 65 and individuals under the age of 65 with disabilities. There's Medicaid, which is provides care to qualifying individuals who cannot pay for their own medical expenses. And there are private insurers or commercial health insurers. So we're thinking about things like Humana, et cetera, that provide coverage for medical expenses. And I think they're typically employer provided. You also have coding agencies. So these create or amend codes when necessary to efficiently support the adoption of new technologies. And then you have healthcare providers. So these are hospitals, clinics, physicians that are providing care to patients. And then you have health technology assessment entities. These are essentially third-party organizations that review new tech and essentially help evaluate the properties, effects, and impacts. I think something to keep in mind with HTAs is they don't look at just safety and efficacy. They also look at social impacts, so things like access to care. They look at economic impact. So is your solution better for the system than the current standard of care? They also look at organizational and ethical issues. So different insurance billing codes exist, and they can be leveraged for new solutions, but sometimes when a new solution comes to market, it typically requires a novel code to ensure the coverage of new innovations. There tend to be multiple different code categories. There's things that are related to diagnostics. There's common procedure coding. There's ambulatory payment classification and international classification of diseases. The main code issuers in the US are typically the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which is the CMS. For anyone looking for or hoping to get an understanding of what codes are out there, the CMS website itself is a great resource. And the American Medical Association. I think one thing that tends to be a misconception among some of the companies that we work with is that the mere existence of a billing code is not sufficient to guarantee payment by an insurer, right? And that's because several other factors influence whether a given solution will be reimbursed or not. So for example, we were looking at solutions in the assistive communication space, and one of our findings was that you needed to meet a standard of medical necessity from the patient side to qualify for reimbursement. So if a company had developed an assistive communication tool targeting patients with trouble communicating, the mere existence of a reimbursement code of a billing code was not sufficient to ensure that their solution would be paid for. And that's why you have cases where many medical device companies also tend to have funding consultants, et cetera. I think again, we're really going at this at a high level. But some of the issues around healthcare commercialization often revolves around data. So just for reference, the global healthcare sector generated around 2.3 zettabytes of data worldwide in 2020. So for ease of communication, a zettabyte is the equivalent of 1 trillion gigabytes, right? But the problem is that a lot of the healthcare systems don't talk to each other. And there are, different protections in place to make sure that healthcare data is not misused, right? I just want to touch upon three concepts today. The first is the concept of real-world data. This is essentially data relating to a patient's health status in real time. And one of the reasons it comes up with some of the solutions we work with is that many companies have found that results from trials, whether proof of concept or later stage trials, are often quite different from real world data. So as much as possible, it would be important for a company to try and generate real world data. Real world evidence is just analysis of real world data generated by different study designs, but it's not limited to trials, although it does include that. Given that today's healthcare solutions deal with a lot of data, there are several, it's really important for a company over time, not necessarily day one, to start maintaining a security and privacy infrastructure, right? So that involves getting comfortable with the relevant privacy regulation in your countries of operation. A lot of the startups that come to us tend to operate in multiple geographies. And what we tell them is that a good standard for them might be to plan to meet the most strict requirements for privacy based on the review of the geographies they plan to operate in. And then finally, we're not going to go into this in detail today, but we typically also help companies with a patent landscape analysis. And that's because IP is such a key part of commercialization strategy for early stage companies. There are many different protection strategies that can be used. You have, I think the one that's most relevant to the companies that we work with tend to be patents and trade secrets. And a lot of times early stage companies come to us and ask us, do I require a patent for, for my solution? And the answer is not always a yes. I think it really depends on the type of solution. For example, hardware patents tend to be longer lived than software patents. And method patents are also, let's say, tend to be less easy to defend than, let's say, hardware patents. So I'll stop there. Adam, do you want to say some final words?
Yeah, no, so we purposely left some time for questions. Albeit the chat was great, and I've been able to exchange with a couple of people already. I think the main goal, and we know people on the call are at different life stages, whether startups or, as an investor or considering different types of investments. The goal is to understand the amount of relevant considerations, right? I mean, we've seen some companies sometimes completely underestimate, I would say, kind of what lies ahead, and kind of, do their fundraise, do their R&D, kind of progress along the roadmap, and then realize, oh my God, I haven't thought enough about reg and reimbursement. I haven't thought about IP. I haven't talked to the FDA. I don't understand the market size as well as I thought, because in theory, it's a large market, but there's such a defined treatment ladder that I don't fit in, that it might be really hard for me to get across. There are just so many considerations that we found to be put aside or not really put at the forefront. So we wanted today to really kind of showcase the extent of what needs to be factored in. With that said, a few things. One, we showed partners on the slide. There are partners, there are advisors, there are investors. There are many entities, well, including ours, which can help in some of those regards. We also ourselves have many partners in the industry that we work with on very specific topics. So for IP, we have preferred, for example, law firms that we work with. We can demystify the neurotech and technical aspect, but we work with them obviously for optimal strategies. The message is you're not alone, and you don't have to figure out everything early. But, we'll talk about it on Thursday, but if you're planning a fundraise and someone says, okay, well, have you thought about reimbursement? What's the strategy there? Are there codes? Have you thought about the economics of it? You should not be surprised, is I think one of the main points. You should have thought about it, have some preliminary perspective on it, And some people also, depending on the investor you want, will see that there's a different levels of scrutiny. Some investors can be very, very detailed and push a company to really kind of go beyond what they thought was necessary to raise. But we find that these also create the best partnerships, because once you pass the due diligence and you were pushed to provide the answers earlier than you thought you would have, you also have a partner with you in the investor if they go ahead with the investment, because they really understand your company and they understand the considerations. The other way around, we've seen companies being excited, especially in the last couple of years, saying, my investor is a generalist, they love what I do, they love the vision, and that can be okay. But we've seen some of those backfire a little bit, where, a couple of years down the road, the investors get a little bit of patience, they don't understand why things cost as much as they do, why the pathway is longer than expected. So we encourage people to think about these questions and to find investors. Again, I'm doing a bit of a segue for Thursday, that can have those discussions with them, because they might be a partner when they push you to answer some of these elements. It's really kind of to think about it with you. So that was really the goal today, to give an overview of different things. We have quite a few minutes, so anyone that has a question on the chat or raise their hand, we're happy to have a discussion. Kay, I don't know if you want to help us moderate that, but we'd be more than happy to do this in the further remainder of the call.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to use the raise hand emoji, go right ahead. Otherwise, people can jump in either to sending things in the chat box or unmuting their microphone and participating that way.
Hi, this is William.
Hello.
Amplified. Hi. We kind of talked about this in the chat, but I would like to get a little bit more insight on the distinction between a product exemption versus a 510K clearance. I know you kind of chatted that, but I think that requires a little bit more context. And what are the strengths and weaknesses of an exemption versus the clearance piece, if you don't mind sharing that?
Yeah. So an exemption is, if we're thinking about exemption categories, we're really thinking about, let's say, humanitarian device exemptions or IDEs, or a breakthrough device designation. I think each of them have different strengths and weaknesses. I'll speak to the breakthrough device designation because it tends to be used commonly by neuro companies. Typically, what that provides is more access to the health authorities, right? Let's say different requirements in terms of, let's say, the size of the clinical trials, a little bit more of a dialogue between the company and the health authority. With a predicate, it's a little bit different because, for example, we've noticed with one of the companies that we worked with, they were using the predicate of a stroke rehabilitation solution to get to market, but they still had to essentially show that their solution was substantially equivalent, right, and to the solution that's already on the market.
Yeah, and I want to be careful with semantics. I think Radhika is right. We've seen many cases where a breakthrough device is assumed to be kind of a pure exemption. I mean, it helps with some steps, but it's typically, like, the very strict definition of exemption is essentially that you might not even have to go through the PMA, essentially, or even sometimes the 510K process, because your solution is very, very low risk and extremely similar and proven to be similar to existing solution. Clearance is kind of the step ahead, where your solution could be a little more risky, and at that time, essentially, you've demonstrated that you're so similar to something that you can go through 510K and not a PMA. I've never seen someone, and Radhika, correct me if I'm wrong, go for a PMA just for the fun of it. I mean, it's a strong statement to say you had to do it and you've gone over it. We've seen many companies saying, you know what, I'm looking at my competitors and I'm monitoring what they're doing. Because if I can go through a 510K because someone has a pathway that I can kind of latch on and kind of, prove the point and say that I'm similar enough, I will do that at the right time. So you can't plan things perfectly, but I would say you're a little bit, how do I say, you're a little bit stuck with your reality at the time you're doing what you're doing. If you want to be the first to market, and your solution is novel, risky, class 3 implantable for something that is different with a different mechanism of action, you will not be able to find a 510K, at least very unlikely. So what we've seen in terms of strategy is more of a, can I argue class 2 versus 3 or 1 versus 2? That's something we've seen more happen. And that's something that we're also very careful about. An example I could give would be for software as a medical device. I know we had a question on that earlier. Depending on the risk of the indication you're trying to solve with your software solution, for example, let's say stroke rehabilitation, you might think that you're a class 1, but we've seen the regulation involved in the last couple of years, and more you're likely to be defined as a class 2. So beyond the exemption and clearance aspects, what we've seen a lot of kind of optimization or efforts to have a better pathway was about how can I argue that my device is a 1 versus 2 or 2 versus 3 in terms of medical class. What I would say, though, is companies have to be realistic with what they're given. It's not a common thing, but we've seen some, even invasive solutions claim that they were consumer applications and try to think about how their pathway could be different. I mean, if you're getting in someone's brain, you're not going to be a low device class risk. This is just not going to happen. So you have to just align with your reality. But that goes back to kind of the pre-submissions and the early conversations with the FDA. We've seen companies, we've actually never had anyone regret doing this. It really helps in defining essentially what you can expect and how you should be thinking about your path.
Great.
Okay.
Any other questions? As we wait, just to let you all know, I dropped the link to register for part 2 if you all were interested in joining. It's the same time, just 2 days away. You'll see Radhika and Adam again, and they'll dive a little bit deeper into some topics they mentioned earlier today, as well as new content. Any final questions from anyone? Oh, I saw one just come in. Would you give some examples about real-world evidence?
Yeah, I think we were I think the one example that comes to mind is for example, some pharma companies are using neurotech solutions or AI-based solutions to gather real-time data on consumer reactions to their products. I'm trying to, unfortunately, I don't recall the name of the company, but these are really like essentially remote patient monitoring solutions that kind of track patient data 24/7 once they've been given a certain medication.
Yeah, and real world data and real world evidence, Radhika?
Yeah, so I think real world data just refers to the actual data collected, right? So it's data relating to patient health status and or the delivery of healthcare. And it's routinely collected from a variety of sources. One example could be your Apple Watch, right? And real world evidence is essentially the analysis of real world data generated by different study designs or analysis. It includes trials, but it's not only related to that.
Yeah, and more broadly beyond the definition, I think one thing that is key in that regard, we've seen many strategics, so I include pharmaceuticals in that category, being a little bit careful when it comes to, obviously the initial studies, the trials that follow, and the actual real world data and evidence. And one of the reasons is sometimes actual engagement from users, actual results. And the best example I could give for, software as a medical device is that the trials are amazing. Everyone is following the protocol. Once you get to the real situation, people don't use this for as long as they're supposed to. They don't use it every day or at whatever frequency they're supposed to use it. And that's namely also where these information come into play. Not just in terms of, is that efficacious, but are users and patients actually doing what they're supposed to? And is my solution working as intended in that regard? And that's a big topic actually we've had with both investors and strategics when it comes to new solutions, which is to say, how are my engagement metrics going to look like, and how do I make sure that this solution is actually going to be used as intended? And that's where these types of data and insights can also come into play and provide a lot of useful information. Yeah. Martin, I don't know if you have a question or if you're just giving us a thumb up. I'm not. Okay. Anything else? I don't know if anyone has a question. Yeah, Lane?
Lane?
Sure, yeah, I'll throw my question out. I was thinking about what you were talking about earlier with the kind of the more lower cost devices that are really consumer, like the Oura Ring, some of those EEG headsets. If those were marketed not claiming, the meditation or all of those health benefits, could they get away without having to be classified as a medical device, since they are kind of looser products?
Yeah, Lane, just to be clear, conventional EEG headbands like Muse, etc., are consumer grade devices. And if you go on their websites, you'll see that they don't necessarily make bold claims about, the quantity of improvement of meditation, etc., right? And they're not making any claims about the health benefits of meditation. The language, if you go on any of these EEG headband websites, is very mitigated, right? They say they support you to meditate or they help you meditate. In contrast, a bolder medical claim would be something like, that they promise to improve or reduce insomnia by, let's say, 10-15%, something quite bold and quantitative, right? So the distinction is like, I agree it's difficult to figure out the exact distinction, but it's a lot vaguer on the consumer side than on the medical side.
Absolutely, and I think the way to think about it exactly is right, because the claims. The second one is the risk, right? If you say I'm gonna get a brain implant because I think that the idea of tweeting with directly from my brain is awesome, and that is something I want to do, it's a consumer device, right? I don't have any medical indication. I don't think that's gonna fly by, right? Because the risk of doing something like this, of the medical procedure involved, is quite high. So when you come to non-invasive, I think even then, while if you're reading brain activity and not claiming anything, there might not be an arm to that. What if you're stimulating? So then it's what's the frequency of the stimulation? What's the intensity of it? So I would say that the gray zone with the consumer applications falls more into that category, something that would be probably class 2 if it was medical, but they're not claiming it is. And that's where I think a deep dive needs to be made. And in the last couple of years, things have changed. We know some companies, again, without providing some names, have had bad surprises, unfortunately, where in the beginning, they could claim to be consumer applications, and in time, regulation evolved, and they fell in the other category.
Thank you so much. That perfectly answers that question. It's a gray zone, it sounds like.
It is a little bit. Yeah, go ahead, Roger.
I think it also depends on the country in which you're operating in, right? So, for example, if you're trying to figure out what your device classification is in, let's say, Canada or the EU, you essentially have access to the guidelines. And typically, the way you work with regulators is that you suggest a device classification, once your product is further along, and they essentially have an iterative discussion with you to see if they agree or not. It's a little different in the US.
Radhika, I alluded to it earlier. I see we have 10 minutes. You want to maybe give a minute to talk a bit about the session on Thursday before we finish?
Yeah, I just want to essentially on Thursday, what we'll be presenting is actual data on fundraising in neurotech companies. I know there have been a lot of interesting articles out there about how neurological devices are a class apart from medtech. I think what we will do is show you all the data that we have, at least based on our database of neurotech companies. We'll essentially talk about the current market environment, what our understanding is of the environment based on conversations with LPs, VC funds, and companies themselves. And then we'll also share a little bit about one aspect which is fairly underestimated when it comes to fundraising, and that's essentially putting together a data room. We're purposely not talking about how to prepare a pitch deck, and that's because I think there's close to 1 million resources out there. You're all very resourceful entrepreneurs, so we'll essentially be alluding to that. And Chris, yes, the data will be covering I think 16 quarters. I have to confirm, but I think it'll be covering a few years of data.
Yeah, thanks, Radhika. Chris, I see a new question. Will the data be covering over several years of collection? I'm not sure the purpose that you're alluding to, but typically yes. And there are two elements that are key here. It's how many people did you get data from, and the amount of data per a certain person, right? And so essentially a lot of companies, what they will try to do, and that's where you're getting into the specificities of the disclaimers and the rule around data in general, GDPR, HIPAA, and others, which we've alluded to earlier, because many companies say, you know what, I'm a consumer company, but I'm collecting a lot of data and I can improve my algorithms. And when my solution is up to par, I'll then switch over to the medical side, right? And because I know that I will be able to substantiate the right claims or the right studies and clinical trials. So I would say in general, data is something that you should consider as a strategy, which is covered over years of collection. Be a little bit careful though with parallels and how you collected the data versus how you want to use it later on. We've seen companies sometimes miscalculate the data strategy, assume that I'll get a lot of data, I'll figure it out later. You might not be collecting it for the same purpose. You want to use it later on, and that will kind of provide a little bit of a disconnect potentially, depending on what you're hoping to claim later. But you should always try to collect data as well as possible from the get-go, and essentially, classify it, label it, and restore it in the most professional way possible. But again, there are so many guidelines in that regard, which we alluded to earlier, that this is in itself a whole session I think that we could have on. Well, you have sorry, I'm just reading the questions as we go.
Adam, I think Healthy Amplified is alluding to, are you talking about the data we'll be presenting next on Thursday related to the fundraising?
The short answer is yes. I've got some pretty biased opinions, and I'd love to see your work around that sector. The most that I see is heavily skewed towards consumer, and I'd love to see the breakdown between consumer versus device, and whether or not it's diagnostic and early detection versus treatment. That's all.
Yes. So we have, unfortunately, we haven't done it for this year, but we do have data from 2022, so I'm happy to share it. I think we're planning on publishing the breakdown for this year later on, towards the end of the year.
Yeah, what I will also say, it's interesting when I see the word diagnostic. A big nuance is, am I providing diagnostic, or am I providing an assessment? Am I just a tool, or am I just providing insights to help with decisions? And that can have significant impact on the rec pathway and essentially how much a company needs to do to get there. What I would say is pure diagnostic play, where you have a solution approved for a full diagnostics. We've seen in neurotech a few, obviously, over the years being approved, but I would say that most of the companies we work with are trying to get to the assessment and try to understand how they can claim things in the meantime, because they know they can provide value and help clinicians with better assessments. But the path to diagnostics is actually quite complex. And, forget what's said in the media. When you talk to companies, behind closed doors, many of them are stressed about getting that leap and getting enough data to say, you know what, I'm a diagnostic tool at this point. The risk of error naturally is a big factor into that. So I'm saying this namely in terms of, how companies are positioning themselves, and some might try to be a little more on the less medical side and more of the, hey, I'm just providing data analytics, you decide, while they definitely hope to help in the context of a diagnostic, if that makes sense. So while we don't have the data, I'm hoping this provides clarifications, because it's a huge topic in terms of, am I giving you some data so you can make a better assessment, or am I an actual diagnostic tool?
Yeah, I would agree. And I think that's part of the reason why I asked the question around the exemption versus the clearance. 90% of the companies in this space are operating under an exemption. I've seen very few with clearances. And if you look at the clearances, the claims are not very strong.
You got it. It's exactly that. So now that I understand the nature of the question, no, I would definitely agree with that. I think what should not be underestimated is many of those that are getting under an exception, they have a plan to get to the clearance, but the clearance from the diagnostic perspective tends to have a very high bar. But then again, like, it's an indication by indication question, right? And depending on the existing evidence, but I would definitely agree with that. Does assessment require FDA approval versus diagnostic? We've seen companies, so yes, companies providing assessments, and that goes back to Radhika's point on claim, have gotten approvals, in some cases, exemptions. Go ahead, Radhika.
Yeah, so again, if you'll recall, we talked about framing things in a risk versus benefit framework, right? So for example, some of the concussion assessment tools have indeed gotten FDA clearance, right? Because the risk of assessment is different, right, for that indication.
And sometimes it's a question of competitive edge, right? I mean, when you are in that gray zone, we've seen some companies say, you know what, I'm going to register with the FDA, and I'm then going to try and go the path towards a clearance or at least an exemption. There's a whole strategy in that regard, right? Because you could play the gray zone and say, I'm only a data analytics platform. But then if you're working and trying to sell this to a clinic that needs to approve it in-house internally, maybe they won't feel as comfortable as another company that have the same capabilities you have, but that might have actually tried to get some form of approval for their tool, whether an assessment or a diagnostic. So even in the gray zone, there's such a thing as a competitive advantage. You might want to kind of use regulation, i.e. I would be an advantage versus something that you just consider as a cost or a nuisance, essentially.
We're hoping we'll see you for part 2 on Thursday. If you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reply back to the Eventbrite where you registered. It goes back to me. And then keep an eye on for the survey. We would love any and all feedback. You'll also have contact information from our speakers today. And again, thank you so much for spending your afternoon with us, and we'll see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.